So the idea of Sim Cafe, I suppose, is a little bit of an escape from all the other news that we're hearing at the moment and all the other things that are going on. I don't know, I'm a bit over it. And I'm missing these events where I'm learning new things and hearing from new people and meeting new people, and especially in sort of a bit more of a casual format as well. So Garth's somebody I met last year through the Serious Games Challenge. He was our winner last year with his driving instruction game, but since then I've got to know Garth a little bit better, and he's a very interesting fellow who has his hand in multiple pots. He makes his own esport, which is called 22 Series Racing. He also knows quite a bit about blockchain, and you can also buy his food products at, is it Coles or Woolworths? One of them.
The rest of the richest one was Woolworths, but we have a new product, Coca Bell, which is at health food shops and cafes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he's a man who wears many hats and has a lot of great ideas about where things are heading in the future as well. So we're starting off with esports, but no doubt we'll hear from him again in the future. So I'll hand over to Garth now. Thanks for coming, Garth.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for having me. I mean, like Dale said, I have a lot of ideas like we all do about what might come in future. Who knows if that will come to pass, but we're all kind of in a new world at the moment. I think everything's getting shaken up, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we're doing the esports topic first. Is you would have probably noticed the esports getting in the news quite a bit more recently than it had in the past. So not only had esports been growing exponentially year on year, but now with real sports closing down, people are moving to esports, and it's just kind of really shaken up the whole esports bag, and we're kind of not really sure how that's going to land. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit. I'll mention first just a quick background on my interest in esports. So being someone who likes motor racing in the real world, personally doing it, and developing video games, and just sort of fair competition. I always saw esports as a really great opportunity for there to be like this actual kind of global competition where everyone has this equal chance of racing and winning and competing and monetizing their own teams and activities and all that sort of stuff. So I've been interested in it for a long time, for about 20 years, and developing my game as an esport for about 10 years. I'll do a little quick introduction. I'll share my screen. Actually, before I do that, one thing I just quickly say is, Dale and I talked about trying to run this kind of like a cafe meeting. So just pretend we're all sitting around a table, just someone asked me about esports and I just start saying stuff. If people want to jump in and ask questions, don't consider this to be a talk where I'm going to present slides and just chew your ear off for 30, 40 minutes. I'll start talking about some stuff. If anyone has questions, just throw the questions in. Happy to answer them on the fly. And then the conversation might end up going a way that you're all more interested in, right? So you can ask me anything about any aspect of what I'm talking about. So I really want to let you guys who are watching this kind of guide the content somewhat, so you get the information that you want out of this too. So what I'll do first is I will share my screen. Just give me 2 seconds. Okay, hopefully you're all seeing my screen. Yep. Cool. Thank you. So yeah, a little quick introduction. So, and this is kind of relevant to what's happening in esports now as well. So, esports started as a digital online thing. So people started competing on LANs locally and then nationally, internationally, of course. And then it started to migrate into these activation spaces where people would, you sort of see up there, the League of Legends World Championship Season 1 in 2011. That was just like a big kind of LAN. Then it went into theatres and arenas over the next sort of few years with quite a bit of growth. To the 2018 World Championship, which was quite massive, like filling out massive stadiums. So it's gotten quite big over the last 10 years, especially. Sorry, let's go back to that slide. But yeah, the interesting thing there is esports had a bit of disruption as well. So they had to suddenly cancel these arena events, and then move back into the digital space. So it was a disruption because there were location-based activations planned, but they were able to bring it back to an online series quite easily. So they were situated to kind of migrate back to their roots. A little quick overview on the structure of esports. It is very similar to a traditional sport, with the you can sort of see on the left-hand side of this slide here, with the exceptions of traditional sports not having a developer or a publisher, and esports not having a governing body. So for the most part, they're very similar, with those exceptions of, I guess, like who's making the money, which tends to lean towards the developer-publisher side rather than the leagues and teams in traditional sports. And the lack of a governing body in esports is kind of both a good and bad thing for different reasons. Again, I'm just trying to give everyone a bit of an overview of some of the background here, so you can sort of think of any questions you might like to ask. I'll make a mention that esports, like traditional sports, is split into a lot of different categories, and there are a lot of different games that are played. So there's not just one thing or one type of thing. There are all kinds of things, from card games to first-person shooters to strategy games, etc. And that's mostly, like, I've got a whole lot of other slides about sort of businessy stuff, which I won't kind of go into, but I can refer back to slides. So if anyone has questions about whether it be legal cases, business, growth, markets, all that sort of stuff, I can get to them. Actually, there is maybe one slide I'll show quickly. Actually, maybe 2 slides. This year shows the growth of video games versus music and film over the last couple of decades. As you can see, games have had a massive growth, so obviously esports have got a large base there. Because we are going to talk a bit about esports versus traditional sports, there's quite a bit of information on this slide, but basically the sort of summary of this is that there's been traditional sports have seen a migration away from sports. So essentially their average viewer or sort of fan base is getting 1 year older every year, because a lot of their fans are kind of, it sounds bad, like kind of dying out. So the fans are getting older, whereas the millennials are coming in and they're viewing more esports and more game content on Twitch, etc. So traditional sports have been, for the last 5 years, sort of more aggressively getting into esports. So a lot of traditional teams that own NFL, NHL, hockey, whatever teams, are buying esports teams to get a sort of a foot in this space. But again, with the big difference being that these people make a lot of money out of traditional sports, but not often so much money out of esports. So that's kind of a change that will come and needs to come. Again, I've got some ideas about how that will get disrupted. Anyway, so I'll kind of go back to a more interesting slide, maybe, if that's good background. So I go back to some of my notes. So that's my kind of basic introduction. So again, back to what's happening right now. So there's been a massive, obviously, like most sports around the world have been shut down. So digital online sports are where it's at. And it's been an interesting case with a lot of different use cases for how that's gone. One of the sort of stranger ones is there's a company out of the UK who do a simulated horse race. I can't remember what horse race it is, but they do a simulated horse race for one of the big sort of steeple horse racing events, and that event was cancelled this year. So they ended up running that simulated horse race as the broadcast, and doing gambling. People were gambling on the results of that race. But yeah, there's kind of 2 tiers of esports that are happening now. So you've got what we would call traditional esports, which is your kind of League of Legends, Rocket League, Overwatch, Counter-Strike, all of that sort of stuff. Those esports probably have seen a little bit of growth, but not as much growth. What you're seeing is a lot of people who are sort of used to watching more traditional sports, and more so in the racing space, who are now finding ways to try to do that sport in a digital online space. So you've got the F1 series, NASCAR, VS of cars, and a lot of others doing that. You've got the NBL even jumping online and doing their own sort of NBL activations. But in the racing space, it's kind of one of the most interesting, because obviously you've got that crossover more so between the simulation of racing in a racing sim, and racing a racing car. So you can have some of the esports sim races and some of the real world races racing together. It's kind of thrown up a lot of interesting issues from a lot of different points of view. So one is that obviously you've got these real world racing car drivers who know how to drive a racing car very well, but they maybe don't have a sim rig, and they maybe don't know. There is a slightly different sort of skill to the two, so they maybe don't know how to use a sim very well, and so they don't want to go into this simulation space and then start losing as a professional driver to some sort of what they see as a hobbyist or e-sport player. And that totally makes sense. I mean, they don't want to sort of ruin their reputation. So in some cases, they're throwing those players in together, like the racers and the esports players. In other cases, they're keeping them separate. In other cases, they're kind of mixing it all up with sort of famous people or legends of the sport, people who were champions 10, 20 years ago, trying to make it a bit more of a spectacle rather than a competition. Some of the other ones.
Just jump in quickly.
Yeah, sure.
There's just a few questions in the chat asking about the male-to-female ratio of players and the audience. Do you know much about that?
No, I don't. I mean, I know for gaming, it's pretty much 50-50 across gaming. I don't have exact stats, but I know in esports there is a big skew towards men, which is quite an interesting one. There's a lot of push from a lot of people to get more females into esports generally, and it hasn't had a lot of success to date. I know people want to sort of know why that is, but yeah, definitely it's more male skewed for esports. If I had to put a percentage on it, I'd say it's above 90, definitely 95% male skewed.
Sorry. Could I ask a quick one, Garth, or is it should I wait?
Yeah. No,
so the obvious one that sort of comes to mind, it's probably a bit getting technical here, but so on your screen, right, you've got multiple online battle arena, three games, three options there, then a first-person shooter, 3 options there.
Yep.
So the question, I guess, or the thought that was going across my mind is, are these pretty much standalone contained, or can players interoperate between them? And what sort of, can you talk a bit about maybe the architectures and the challenges of or standards if they exist in that space?
Yeah, sure.
These things are built here.
Yeah, cool. That's kind of a lot of questions, but I can answer them. That's right.
I'll go back on mute.
Okay, that's all right. That's cool. I can answer them one by one. So jump in if you think I've forgotten one of them. So there's no interoperability between the games themselves. So yeah, like I mean, if you're playing in one, you're playing in one. It's a very sort of standalone sport. From a player point of view, from a team point of view, different teams will have or different. It's kind of like two sides. It's like different teams might have different sort of sub teams, or one team that does different sports. So they might have someone. They don't usually cross. I'm gonna look at my own slide here. They usually cross between like Project Cars and Warcraft 3, but they might have a team that does League of Legends and Overwatch, sort of in that sort of first-person shooter thing, or they might have 2 separate teams. So there is some crossover between what people sort of play, but typically they want a team who just focuses on one sport. So they might play one game like 8 hours a day practicing. So you can imagine just if that's what every team is doing, then some other team is doing 4 hours on League of Legends and 4 hours on Overwatch. Obviously, they're going to suffer, but that just comes down to the funding of the team. And another topic, which is another technical challenge, which is interesting, there's 2 parts to this, which is some of these games are PC games and other games are console games. And this is a huge thing. So, for example, NBL 2K, it's largely played on a console. So to then take that online as an esport is very difficult. So a lot of those sports games like NBA 2K, FIFA, and NHL's not on there on my list, but NHL is quite a big one. The American football. So they play a lot of those in a location. So they get all the consoles into a location and sort of wire them up together, and then everyone comes and plays on the controller on a console. So they haven't been able to switch to the sort of digital format so well. There are other examples where in the racing one there, you got should I put it in the sport one, Rocket League. So Rocket League is kind of I'll switch down to it. I've got some screenshots. So Rocket League it's got cars, but it's just a soccer game basically. So there's a ball, there's between 3 to 5 players on a team, but it's just essentially a soccer game. So this can be played on PC, it can be played on consoles, and depending on the game, you can actually have people playing against each other. So you can have one player on a PC and another player on a console. Typically for competition, for like serious competition, they'll just be on PC versus PC. But yeah, you can actually play console versus PC. Does that answer all your questions?
Yeah, well done. You've covered a lot. So the opportunity for actually reuse across gaming platforms is pretty limited, right? Of building blocks, for example. So each of them creates their own.
Yes, that's right. Yes, right. So as a developer, and yeah, just to kind of clarify, I'm coming from a developer side. As a developer, if you're making the PC game versus the console and the mobile, it's a lot of work. So to do each of those is like a kind of a whole other project. There's a little bit of obviously reuse of assets, but all assets need to be sort of changed and optimized, and there's a lot of work between them. So you can't just sort of push the button and roll it out on all straight away. There's work involved. I didn't mention mobile actually. So PUBG, so that's PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds. I actually don't think I've got a screenshot of it, but we could look at Counter-Strike as a rough example. So PUBG is a game that you might have heard of. That went massive on PC maybe about 3 years ago. That's hit mobile now. That sort of went on mobile maybe up to a year ago now. It sort of feels more recent than that. But you can actually play people on PC versus mobile. So you can actually, that's like quite a big difference. Obviously, there's like with a computer, you've got a mouse and a keyboard, so you can sort of like move around fast and shoot very, very fast. On a mobile phone, you're very limited. They've installed rules where you can get like these adapters. Well, there's two things. You can plug a controller into a phone, or you can use an adapter on top of the phone. It sort of flips on, and as you push buttons, it sort of touches on the screen for you. So they've tried to bring in rules so you can't use any of those kind of mods you've got to like use on the touchscreen. Obviously, people circumvent that. There are ways to circumvent it, but yeah, they try to bring in rules to sort of keep those markets separate. But you can even do mobile versus PC.
Thanks, mate. There's lots of questions coming in on the chat about engines and so on. So you might want to have a look at that.
Yeah, Dale, did you want to manage that for me? You'd be the
sure.
MC. Yeah.
So the first question is from Jillian. Is there anything happening in the Aussie rule space?
Cool. Yeah. That's a great question. Not that I know of. I could definitely find out. I know the developers who make the AFL games. I know they don't sort of tend to, as a developer, they don't tend to look at esports. The AFL League themselves did get into League of Legends. So AFL were trying to get into esports and get a foot in that space. They ran a thing called the Oceanic League, which was a separate league using League of Legends. It didn't go so well. And I think some of them are selling out of that. I'm not sure what their plans are. But and this is kind of an interesting point, going back to what we're saying about racing working really well as an esport, and things like NBL 2K, basketball not working as well as an esport. I think a lot of the bigger sports leagues have realized that their sport might work quite well in a real world setting, but it may not work as well in a digital setting. So it would be sort of remain to be seen whether there's much activity for like an actual AFL game played as an AFL esport. I don't know that it would really do very well. It might work well as a bit of a spectator thing with a few sort of old sort of people from the game, like I don't know, Dermot Brereton or something, jumping in and playing and having a bit of a laugh. But I don't know that it would be very successful as a competitive league.
Yeah, and I think that's a topic that's probably we could talk about for a long time, is what's easily translated to online and what can't be translated to online, because that's something that we all have to face in our jobs is, okay, now we're all working from home, but what learning activities can we do from home?
Mm-hmm.
And what do we have to try to figure something else out for?
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to invite Nicholas Watt to chat, because he's been answering quite a few questions and seems to have a bit of an esports background as well. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can do a little bit of intro. I've worked in video games for about 20 years, from PlayStation 1 onwards. And then a couple of years ago, I worked for Riot Games out in the Hong Kong studio doing user experience design. I've actually maybe met, I'm not sure, a couple of you have been down to one of the campuses in Canberra to talk to some of the people in the military before. And then this last year, I've been working for a blockchain gaming startup called Immutable in Sydney, where kind of doing one of the biggest, I think it's one of the biggest DApps, they call them, on the blockchain at the moment. Yeah, so is there anything in particular you wanted me to answer or talk about at the moment?
No, I just thought it was good if you introduced yourself, and feel free to chip in whenever if you like.
Sure. Okay. I did want to cover So the Ben's question about pushing esports into the mainstream media. So obviously in the like in Australia, we're a little bit behind, like in terms of necessarily leading the world in these things. Like ESPN in America does stream, and I think has partnerships with Riot Games to stream a lot of the esports online, on both online and on television. And South Korea is probably one of the places that's kind of led the field in a lot of the esports domain, and is kind of the grassroots of where it really started as well. So you find a lot of people play in what they call PC bangs, which are like effectively internet cafes, and a lot of it's because of the camaraderie. So they'll go there after work or when they've got spare time, and a bunch of their friends will be there and they'll be playing these games together. And that's kind of where the whole esports movement kind of started. And we're talking like StarCraft 1, which I think is over 10 years, maybe even 15 years ago now.
Yeah, it really started in South Korea to kind of get big at about 10 years ago. And I sort of think South Korea is about 10 years ahead of the world, give or take. Yeah, I think there are 3 channels last I knew that stream StarCraft 2 full-time, like 24/7 StarCraft. 3 channels in South Korea. The StarCraft players in South Korea are considered like superstars. They walk around and just get mobbed by fans wanting autographs. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Can I ask both of you a question? And going back to the point before, I guess, was what's sort of the split between totally original esports which are coming from real sports and are quite faithful, like the racing and things like that, and then enhancements of existing sports, and how are things playing out there?
Well, I'll sort of start on that firstly. So the interesting case, and this is one of the cases that we make with the development of our game, is that traditional sports work well as traditional sports because they've been proven over in a lot of cases over centuries, hundreds of years, right? And a lot of what makes them great is that physical interaction. So what people love about going to the football is there's a bit of rough and tumble and people knocking each other, and they just get that excitement from seeing humans hitting other humans and whatever. In the racing scene, there's that kind of sense of this human is putting their life on the line. Like they go into that corner, they're braking at the last possible meter, and they could crash. So there's that sort of uncertainty, which is very exciting, and that sort of risk. So those sports don't typically translate so well as an esport because that risk is just completely gone. Everyone's a digital thing now, and it's just not as interesting. The games that tend to work well as an esport are the ones that have some other strategy element. So there's some other layer of complexity in the game, whether it be like Counter-Strike, where there's sort of the 2-tier thing of Twitch reaction speeds, and then team play, kind of knowing the map and having that sort of player strategy. So I don't think many traditional sports actually convert to an esport very well. Motor racing is the closest, but even that lacks a lot of the excitement. So in future, I don't think esports will, as a racing sim, will overtake F1 at all. But in the meantime, it's a good sort of stopgap solution.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I would say probably the biggest traditional sport that's translated into an esport, and I could be wrong about this, is probably football or soccer, as you like to call it. So EA have probably had the biggest success with their FIFA franchise, which I think they've translated quite well into the digital space. I'm not actually sure, like between it and Formula One or racing, I'm not sure of where the split would be, but they're by far probably the lower ones in terms of, FIFA probably makes the most revenue compared to racing games, I imagine. But League of Legends, CSGO, which is I think the one up here, and World of Tanks, interestingly, which is almost 100% simulation, are probably the biggest revenue generators and probably have the biggest audience in the world for these sorts of things.
Well, yeah, the interesting thing between those projects is there's kind of one soccer game that everyone plays, and that's FIFA.
Yeah.
There's kind of one tank game that everyone plays, and that's World of Tanks. In the sim racing scene, there's a lot of racing games. There's obviously the F1 game. There's iRacing. There's rFactor. There's Project Cars. So that's a big difference as well.
I think it's a really interesting space. One of the hypotheses I have is that for it to reach like critical mass, like there's people who generally it started because people have want to become better at these games, and then they've started watching people on YouTube on like how to get better, and then they've started following people, and then the teams and the Twitch streamers and so on and so forth have fallen up. And so a lot of these games aren't necessarily designed to be super understandable from a sports perspective, right? Like if you turn on the TV and watch American football or baseball or golf, or snooker or tennis or any traditional sport, even if you don't know much about them, it's fairly easy, maybe snooker accepted and darts, it's fairly easy quite quickly to kind of get the gist of what the goal of the game is, because you just need to follow the ball, right? If you ever turn on a stream, if you've never played League of Legends and try and turn on a stream of League of Legends, it's almost impossible to work out what the heck's happening, right?
Yeah, I've just changed the screenshot to League of Legends as an example. It's absolutely manic. There's a million things happening on screen. To go back again to Rocket League, this is probably one of the most, or like a FIFA, but like the traditional sports games like the soccer cars or FIFA, they're quite easy to understand, but they aren't as big in esports as these kind of StarCrafts or League of Legends. And I kind of, to talk about the design point of view, it's kind of interesting. Again, like my interest in esports started 20 years ago. I was working at a company and we were playing Quake 3, which is a first-person shooter, which some of you might know. And we were very competitive and very much into it. We'd play on lunchtimes and Friday after work and have some beer and pizza, and we'd get right into it, play for a couple of hours, and then we'd go home and we'd all go out to bars or do whatever we wanted to do after that. And then Counter-Strike came out, and the dynamic change was something very particular. It wasn't built to be an esport, but something very particular about the design of Counter-Strike that was very addictive in a competitive sense. So the two things that I saw change with the team that I was working with, had a team of about 50 people. And I kind of shared an office as a junior artist and lived with the two guys that I shared an office with. So we kind of got to hang out quite a lot together. So we'd play Counter-Strike after work on a Friday night. Suddenly it went from being a casual fun thing to being ultra competitive, almost people fighting about what happened and who did what and is someone cheating or whatnot. And then would play for longer at the office. Everyone was more hyped and tense about the intensity of the sport. And then we'd go home, and instead of going out as sort of 22, 23-year-olds on a Saturday night, my two housemates would then go onto their computers at home and play again Counter-Strike online with people overseas until like 4 a.m. So that wasn't designed to be an esport, but it had a very particular design that made it good as an esport. And that's typical of most games that are played as esports now. There's only one kind of successful case of a game that was designed to be an esport, and that's Overwatch. But that's got Activision Blizzard's kind of big kind of bank balance to then sort of prop that up and make a league and promote that league. So historically esports were just happened. In the future, I think more of them will be designed. Are there other questions or?
Yeah, there's an interesting discussion going on in the chat just about, I guess, and Nick's chimed in, but Kaysen asked quite a good question about how games could appeal to a more gender diverse audience.
Mm-hmm.
And is it built into the game or is it something else? Nick's mentioned sort of toxic masculinity and part of the culture of gaming.
Yeah.
But that'd be interesting to chat to as well, because I guess we've seen, I don't know, in my life, I've seen football change from, in the 80s, it was probably predominantly males to now it's almost a 50-50 thing. So
I think having worked at Riot, I think part of the challenge is there's no it's like in traditional sports, men play football at a high level, right? And I don't know if they're doing very much to change that. But you watch, all of the big sports, it's predominantly men. Like golf, I think there's a separate women's league than there is the male championship. It's the same with soccer. I'm not sure whether Formula One divides like that, whether you can actually drive a car, like if there's any limitations. So I think it's really interesting that the confluence of like dominant sports that the world watches in the physical world are very traditionally male dominated, particularly from a popularity and broadcast perspective. And this filters down. That's interesting. So no limits in Formula One. I didn't know that. But also having worked at Riot, like I think one of the things that they could be doing and that they should be pushing for is to have a more because there's no reason that men and women can't compete in electronic games, right? It's a purely skill and reaction and mental achievement basis. There's no, you can generate muscles better than anyone else, whatever. And so one of the things these companies could be doing is making more stringent rules around, like, you have to have a 50-50 gender split, or you have to spend, like, I think that moment's waiting to happen, and someone will take that and say, like, the teams that are competing up at high level need to start having more gender diversity, and it will take pushes like that to trickle down. I'd be interested in, Garth might completely disagree with me.
Look, I think it's a really complex topic. I'll speak to the 2 points that you brought up first, Dale. One about the sort of toxic. I won't just call it toxic masculinity, just toxic full stop in esports, but you could call it just online. So there is that sort of social behavior element of people doing stuff online that they wouldn't do in real life, right? Like, you get people behind the wheel of the car and they'll honk the horn, which is the equivalent of walking up to someone in the street and just yelling at them. Like, people, once they've got that kind of barrier removed, people don't behave very well in an online space. And that's just definitely true of all sort of digital forms, social media, etc. There are things you can do with the way you develop software that can change that. So there's some great cases with Dota. I'm quite sure it was Dota, who actually changed the way some of the kind of user experience flow to change user behavior in the game. So what they did is, after they had a behavioral scientist come in and help them sort of figure this out. So after a match, they'd have a question come up on the screen saying, like, what was the best thing that someone did in this match? So they kind of do these like prompts to get people to think about the positive things that happened. So to kind of like change the mood into positive thinking, as opposed to just going on there and saying, oh, screw you, you ruined our chances, you did something bad, right? So there are things you can do in the game to kind of promote positive experiences. Plus, obviously, like, there's all the sort of ban rules. So if somebody buys, the sort of two parts of this, if somebody buys a game and they have toxic behavior in the game, you can kick them out of the game and they lose their money. So that's kind of like a bond that they put down. If you have a free-to-play game like League of Legends or Fortnite, then if somebody gets banned for being toxic, they can just start another free account. So there's nothing to lose. So having a payment gateway stops toxic behavior. On the gender thing, it's kind of been interesting. It's very hard actually for a lot of the teams, leagues, and developers to negotiate, and publishers to negotiate this. There was a case with StarCraft 2 where they made a male-female league to try to bring women in and promote women to come in, but then that sort of turned into a negative campaign, because people were saying, well, why do you have to separate men and women? There is evidence to show that men do have, don't quote me on this one, because this is not sort of my interest, but men are better at esports for some reason. I don't know if that is to do with reaction times, or just that they are more competitive by nature, or something. So yeah, don't take that as kind of rote by me, but men are more inclined to do it, and men do tend to beat the female teams for whatever reason. So it's very hard for them to go, okay, we put them all together, but then women might not see it as fair because they're losing to some male teams for whatever reason that I can't explain. Or if they make separate leagues, then they might get abused for kind of keeping them separate and not allowing them to compete. So it's a minefield. It's a political minefield at the moment. I'll speak from my example. So with our game, we won't be having any male-female leagues at all. Like, we'll sort of try to remove that barrier and allow people to have a bit more anonymity in the game. So I personally wouldn't promote male-female leagues, but it's tricky for other teams. Actually, on one other point, Nicholas asked about traditional racing. So there is no sort of male-female league in traditional racing. It's every gender is allowed to do it. You don't see women at the high tiers in motorsports, and that could be for a number of reasons. I mean, one of the best ones that I think of is that the male brain just develops through puberty differently to a female brain. So from what I've read, and some people could probably chime in on this, male brains sort of develop backwards forward. So their sort of risk assessment develops later. So young men tend to be a bit more risk, a bit happy to take a lot more risk, which kind of leads them to do motor racing, whereas women tend to understand the risks a lot more and know that this is incredibly dangerous. You do see some women in lower tier racing leagues, in motorbikes and car leagues, but they tend to finish 20th and below, and They get sponsorship because they are female, so they can stay on the grid for a while. But if they just kind of come 20th or below for a few seasons, then they lose their sponsorship, and they just haven't kind of filtered up. But there's no gender gateway in motorsport that I know of.
Okay. Kathleen's got her hand up. Did you have a question or comment, Kathleen?
Just a comment, actually. So I used to actually play a fair bit of MOBAs, and so I just want to talk about the gender ratio a little bit.
So what game was that, Kathleen?
Heroes of the Storm. Do you know that one? It's a Blizzard production. So that one was actually designed to counter a lot of the issues that was in Dota and LoL. So for those of you who don't know, in LoL and Dota, there's inter-team competition. So obviously you fight the opponent. There's also intra-team competition. So the 5 players in the same team, they compete for gold, for experience. So someone who performs well in their own sphere would get a lot more, would progress a lot more during the match than other people. So Blizzard actually tried to do a way where all the experience and gold is shared between the whole team. Because a lot of things that people observed in LoL was that if someone makes a mistake or doesn't do very well in the first 10 minutes, they get blamed for dragging the team down. Or if they steal someone else's contribution, again, they get blamed as well. Whereas if the idea was that in Heroes of the Storm, if experience and gold is evenly distributed, then there's no intra-team competition. And that has appeared to work pretty well. And the other thing for the female is that, from what I understand, and I could be wrong, some Korean teams did try to bring in women for Overwatch, but because in Korea the esports teams are run like a real sport, as in they live in the same dormitory, they eat the same food, they basically are like flatmates to each other. There was a lot of resistance from the men for bringing a woman into their dormitories, and obviously that meant separate facilities, other things, and eventually that was dropped as being a logistics hurdle rather than anything else. And lastly, in terms of how aggressive females and males get, I do kind of feel that when there is a risky situation, women tend to have just a little bit more, just maybe like a split second more of decision making to assess all the risks, whereas guys are more likely to just go for it. So in MOBA, at least, you will see a lot more men playing frontline or assassins, so opportunistic players, whereas females are more inclined to play a healing character or support character, or someone who is not so dependent on luck and opportunity, but more dependent on something that's less unpredictable. So that's basically my comment. Do you have anything?
Yeah, well, there's another interesting kind of part to that. I've heard in with resumes for jobs that men are more inclined to overstate their skills and experience to
that's definitely
promote
true.
themselves, whereas women are more inclined to understate their skills and experience. So there's this really kind of crazy mentality, the difference, and it seems to.
But then at the same time, there's a lot of very aggressive women. So for example, women athletes, they are fairly, they're not risk averse. They are fairly, they tackle everything head on. So I'm not sure why in esports you see this trend of women on average being less aggressive than men. Yeah,
it's strange. I think these things, like Dale said about how sort of football maybe 30 years ago is very different to football now. And I dare say I think that might happen with esports as well. Like, to use a personal sort of example, like, I was developing games in my early 20s, and I'd go to bars and try to meet girls, and I would never tell them that I'm a game developer. It's like, you tell a female that you're a video game developer in 99, 2000, and they run away. Like, women just didn't like games or anything to do with games back then. But for whatever reason, men sort of were more prone to go to video games. So I think that'll change as like, I look at my my nephews and nieces and friends now, and like, young women are playing games. Absolutely, it's a generational thing. Yeah, Nicholas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting topic, because I think if you look at, a lot of this is engendered through the history of the industry, right? So like, predominantly it was men making games, and predominantly what they were making was games for themselves, or games that they understood that they would like. And it's only in probably like the rest of the world, the last sort of 10 or 15 years, where you've started to see a lot more women. And there's always been women in the industry, but there's probably a lot more women coming into the industry now.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if you look at the champion designs, say, League of Legends, when it first came out, any female characters were to titillate the boys, right? They had low cut tops, they expose a lot of chest, they're very thin, and they're trying to have a lot of sex appeal. The female champions in particular, and the champions are designing now, are much more aimed at a diverse audience. They're introducing a lot more minority representation. They're also introducing a lot, like, focusing on like female champions and characters that will appeal ideally more to women as much as men, rather than just ones men. And I think, to Kathleen's point, like games like Overwatch, Blizzard in particular with Heroes of the Storm and Overwatch, I think they've got a long history of working in this space, right? StarCraft was one of the first esports, and they've probably seen a lot of like how the audience shapes, and that there is a really big gap in the market. So like, men are very well serviced, but women aren't. And so with games like Hero of the Storm and Overwatch, and particularly Overwatch, they've really focused on making a very diverse set of characters. And I don't know about the esports representation, but definitely the player base of Overwatch, I think, is much closer to being 50-50 than, say, a game like League of Legends or World of Tanks probably is.
Yeah, I think you'd be right. Yeah. Look, to go back to the sort of development point of view, is one thing I say to people, like, regardless of gender, is if you're developing a game, it's not easy to develop a game. You're going to be working on that game for years. It's going to be a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. So develop something that you love, because you're going to go up every day and make it, and develop something that you like, because if you can make something that's perfect for you, then hopefully people out there in the world will agree, right? So I think that's kind of the split for a female, a sort of more female targeted esport, is I think it's going to have to be developed by women who understand more so what them and their friends or whatever want, and help to find that group. Whereas, yeah, traditionally male developers have developed what they like, and it's attracted more men, yeah. Were there any other questions?
A quick one, right? So you sort of touched on it a lot, but is there a need for, or is there an existing sort of regulatory ethical framework that go around games and to ensure, that certain things are okay and certain things aren't? Or is it pretty much evolution, natural selection that sort of does it?
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic. I think there are pros and cons. To use, I'll use an example in the education system, I guess, is League of Legends, which again is on the screen now. Riot have been doing a big push to get League of Legends used as an esport in high schools, and they're promoting it in a whole bunch of different ways, but traditionally sort of for two reasons. They're promoting it as a great way to kind of engage students, teach them about sort of teams and leadership and those kinds of traditional sort of very sports-based kind of roles. But then there's also the sort of another way to engage with like students who are maybe disruptive in class and who don't mix quite so well, they're anxious in class situations or whatever. So maybe gaming is a great way to kind of bring them back into the school and stop them from dropping out of school, which is great. But the problems I see there is it's quite a marketing thing as well. So obviously Riot want to get people playing their game as early as possible so that they play it at school and then they play it at home and then they're buying stuff in the game. So there's definitely kind of a two-pronged approach, and because there is no governance at the moment on esports in particular, and we're all kind of in the Wild West of trying to figure this out. There are kind of no rules or better options. Everyone's trying to figure out what is good and what's good or what's bad about it. Personally, I think it'll change. I would like to see esports being used in schools to be giving more back to the students and more back to the schools on a few different levels. But one of those levels being STEM. So video games have this, like with gamification of education, which we probably all know quite a bit about. Games are a fantastic opportunity to teach kids, students about design, architecture, systems, physics, effects, a whole lot of different things. I mean, games are right for that. You're in the game, you can switch into editor mode, do things, play the game again, see how that change affected the gameplay. In our case, with our racing game, you can tune a vehicle, like a team could tune a vehicle or build a vehicle. Then they could race it sort of college versus college with the different vehicles and then see who wins and then discuss the physical attributes and then look at the data. So I would personally like to see more esports like that being used in schools that are giving something back to the school. And I think regulation will help with that. But at the same time, I haven't worked in a sporting industry that's been regulated. I know from people who do that, sometimes they don't like the regulators. Obviously, the regulators come in and sort of put the ban hammer on a lot of stuff. That's probably good. So there's a great balance somewhere in the middle where you've got innovation versus sort of innovation of good ideas versus suppression of bad business principles.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. I think largely it's led by, capitalistic principles, right? So like if you do something really bad in your game, your audience is going to complain pretty fast, and you're probably not going to make very much money. And so like to date, for better or for worse, there's certain things that have just been let slide because the audience hasn't complained about it. You're not really breaching any laws, say making a game that only caters to one particular person. But things like loot boxes is an interesting example where the industry is always innovating for different ways to make money. And loot boxes have become one now that's obviously quite a hot topic, in certain countries in the world have legislated against that and introduced, governance essentially that the industry now has to start paying attention to. So it's a little bit Silicon Valley, like I guess, in that, they ask for forgiveness rather than ask for permission in a lot of things. And then, people spend / the number of people playing ultimately dictate whether these things are successful or not.
Yeah, and again, from a governance point of view, it's interesting. Like the way it kind of works, like the way it works internationally is different for each country. So in Australia, if we have some kind of platform where we say, okay, esports are this, and here's some formula that's been governed in legislation for how esports should operate, that's good, because that means that then we have awareness around how the police respond if there's been some gambling or something in a sport. How do we, like, what's the sort of, if you hold an esport event, what's the sort of process of allowing authorities to know, so that they've got the things in place, or that sort of procedures in place, all that sort of stuff. So that's good in Australia, whereas in America it's the opposite. So, and a lot of these games are developed out of America. So you've been trying to get the IGA have been trying to get these American publishers and developers to agree to this set of standards and this legislation for Australia to help it operate smoother in Australia, but they won't sort of, well, let's say they're apprehensive to sign anything that commits them to some legislation, because they see that kind of government governance as a bad thing and that it might inhibit them. So they kind of aren't coming to the table in governance either. I know the Australian government are trying to come up with a solution to that, but they've got to sort of cross-border, get these American companies to agree. And a lot of these titles are owned, like Epic's 50% owned by Tencent. Riot, I think, is 100% owned by Tencent. So you got to get like Tencent in China to agree to Australian legislation. So it's very difficult.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in there. Can everybody please give Garth and Nick for chipping in so much a bit of a round of applause? So thank you.
Yeah.
It's nice to get some real feedback. Next week, as you may have heard, Kathleen Yin will be talking about games as behavioural medicine. So just another spin on what we're all sort of interested in. Thanks for coming, and see you next week.